Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome everyone to the second edition of Face Off, GMF's new live snap debate, featuring one question and two opinions in 30 minutes. I'm Lindsay Gorman, Emerging Technology Fellow at the German Marshall Fund's Alliance for Securing Democracy, and today we're going to talk about the diplomats from the People's Republic of China on technology platforms. The internet was born on the simple premise that anyone with a device could connect with anyone else around the world, and on the idealistic promise of a free and open global information commons. But when the internet entered China in the 1990s, the seeds of control entered with it. Through the Golden Shield Project and the Great Firewall, the Chinese Communist Party monitors and administers the information environment within China and has sought to cordon off the country's digital sphere from the rest of the world. Since 2009, Western technology platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and the Google suite among them, have been blocked in China to stifle dissent and ensure regime stability, even before the Arab Spring spread and grew across social media. And so for most of the last decade, Chinese presence on Western information platforms has been minimal. Over the last year, however, Chinese diplomats have flocked to Twitter to push pro-Beijing narratives that often run counter to the facts on key issues from geopolitics to public health. Data from the Alliance for Securing Democracy's Hamilton dashboard shows a 250% increase in accounts since the Hong Kong protests began in April of 2019. The use and also manipulation of Twitter as a tool for information influence has continued through the coronavirus pandemic, where wolf warrior diplomats have engaged in coordinated campaigns to cast doubt and sling accusations over COVID-19's origins and repeatedly threaten countries that refuse to fall in line. Twitter was one of the key vectors of Chinese messaging and disinformation in Europe as well during the height of the COVID crisis there in March and April of 2020. There is also evidence of foul play when it comes to the dissemination of Beijing's narratives. In August 2019, Twitter shut down a significant state-backed information operation originating from within the PRC. Undissuaded, Beijing persevered in its efforts, and Twitter had to step in again in June 2020 to shut down almost 175,000 accounts that were involved in a range of manipulative and coordinated activities on behalf of the Chinese state. Earlier this year, US Senator Ben Sasse and Representative Mike Gallagher called for Twitter to ban diplomatic accounts spreading propaganda in a public letter to CEO Jack Dorsey. At a time when the United States and its democratic partners in Europe and around the world are debating how best to respond to increasing aggressiveness and disruption from the CCP, the technology and information contest is front and center in these debates. And there's a growing sense that the PRC has exploited the openness of democratic systems in trade, in technology, and in the information sphere without providing any move towards increasing transparency or accountability itself. Democracies are faced with a choice. Do they continue to allow the PRC state and companies free rein in these open systems, or is action to limit this exploitation needed? And in the information space, what level of action is needed and warranted? This brings us to our debate question. Should Chinese diplomatic accounts be banned on Twitter? Yes, says Congressman Mike Gallagher, representative of Wisconsin's 8th Congressional District and member of the House Armed Services Committee. Thank you for joining us today, Mike. No, says Miriam Lexmann, member of the European Parliament on the Committee of Foreign Affairs and a former director of the International Republican Institute, IRI. They are both members of the new Interparliamentary Alliance on China. Hello, Miriam. Thank you both. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Now, before I give you both the floor to present your arguments, we'll go to our poll, which will be up for 30 seconds. To the audience, please cast your vote on the pop-up. Should Chinese diplomatic accounts be banned on Twitter? Vote yes or no. And while we're waiting, you're also welcome to tweet about the debate using the hashtag GMFFaceoff. And I will let you know that our third installment of Face Off will be held also on October 15th on the subject of Iran and the JCPOA. Thank you so much for voting. We will conclude the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we'll repeat the poll at the conclusion of the debate and see which side has persuaded more of the audience. I'll now give Mike and Miriam 5 minutes each to argue their case. Time will be stopped by an audio signal. And so Mike and Miriam, when you hear the bell, your time is up. Should Chinese diplomatic accounts be banned or Twitter? Mike, over to you for your opening case for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Lindsay and Miriam. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm looking forward to working more with you going forward through IPAC. Any friend of IRI is a friend of mine, as Mark Green used to represent my district, and he's a great man. So there's a connection between the European Parliament and Northeast Wisconsin. So my position is simple. Officials from governments that deprive their own populations of access to the free flow of information on social media should not be able to leverage those same social media platforms to spread propaganda. It's actually not about the nature of the propaganda itself. It's about denying their own citizens access to the very platforms they weaponize against us. We all know that the internet was founded on openness and connectivity, but it goes without saying that those values are not how the Chinese Communist Party views it. In fact, the very notion of an open and accessible internet is anathema to the party's absolute grip on power and its increasingly Orwellian use of technology to maintain social control. To the CCP, the internet isn't just about erasing events like Tiananmen Square from memory. It's a tool to instill fear, silence critics, and enforce subservience. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the parallel online universe that the CCP has constructed for its citizens. Rather than reading the day's news in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, Chinese citizens are subjected to soulless propaganda from state media. Rather than sharing videos and pictures with friends and family over Facebook and Instagram, they are forced to endure extensive CCP censorship and monitoring on WeChat. And when it comes to Twitter, a tool that leaders from governments across the world increasingly use to communicate with audience, both domestic and foreign, Chinese citizens are left out by their own government. So make no mistake, technology decoupling is already here, and it has been directed by the Chinese Communist Party. Of course, the Chinese government and its state media apparatuses have no such limitations on their own internet use. The Chinese government and its mouthpieces frequently use Twitter in particular to distribute propaganda and disinformation. Most prominently, CCP officials have tweeted disinformation surrounding the origins of the COVID pandemic, lying that the Chinese government has been completely transparent throughout the crisis, covering up China's missteps, and shamelessly propagating conspiracy theories that the U.S. Army created the coronavirus. The CCP's use of Twitter extends well past the pandemic, though, to general disinformation. It includes attempts to whitewash its ongoing crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. Given the urgency of the pandemic and the speed at which information travels online, the CCP's disinformation about COVID is the clearest example yet of how the party's access to a propaganda platform enables it to inject disinformation directly into international discourse. In 2018, Twitter acted to suspend more than 280 Iranian Twitter accounts that engaged in, quote, coordinated manipulation. More recently, Twitter has taken the important step of labeling official government and state media accounts. This represents important progress after our letter. Yet the CCP's activity clearly falls within the scope of coordinated manipulation, which Twitter used to act against Iranian bots. I think a reasonable person might ask whether anyone is actually swayed, however, by CCP wolf warriors, and if having this propaganda out there really moves the needle in support of the CCP's objectives. Well, for one, the party clearly thinks so. And that's why you've seen CCP officials being so combative on Twitter since the crisis began. But secondly, and more importantly, Twitter is a useful microcosm of the CCP's goal of infiltrating and co-opting Western institutions. From the UN to the internet itself, the CCP seeks to distort and manipulate institutions away from their original intent in order to serve the party's objective. Twitter, to the party, is not a vehicle for open discussion and debate, but a tool to spread disinformation to ease its international campaign to silence both. It is time we defend our institutions, including our social media platforms, from this assault. That is all.
Great, thank you, well done, fantastic. Should Chinese diplomatic accounts be banned on Twitter? No. Miriam Lexmann, over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. And thank you, Mike, for all your arguments, which I to a certain extent support, and I do know that China is a great challenge we have to stand up to, but I might bring some other arguments which would shed a different position or shed different light on the same argument. I think I would start maybe with the interesting comment that the fact that I, as a European, where the freedom of speech is usually more restricted than in the US, I stand on the no side. I think that shows already that the answer to this question is extremely difficult, and it's not simple to find out a way how to go about the increasingly sophisticated Chinese propaganda. I would maybe bring other argument is that I come from a former totalitarian state, and I know that if we start to restrict freedom of speech or any kind of freedom, it might turn against us, although we might have a very positive arguments for it or positive goal for it. So that's a kind of an underlying argument for me, that if we fight for an equal treatment of everyone, we cannot start to restrict freedoms or access to freedoms to certain people because we understand that their freedom is used against us. I'll bring other arguments. It's that I think that we are also on a slippery slope when we are trying to influence, a state start to influence a public company and tell the public company who should have access to their products or not. Because we are operating in a global world, and it's very difficult to actually make or distinguish between these people who should have access to this company and who should not. This brings also the argument that why, for example, we would start to ban Chinese diplomats and not ISIS warriors who also use Twitter into manipulating population of the West as well, our population, but also to support their positions in the countries where they fight their fight. So I think that this is very difficult in a global world to start to restrict rules, because we obviously cannot distinguish among citizens of certain countries because the companies operate in a global world as we as well have to capture it. This obviously brings the question how to argue that Twitter should be accessible to people in China, because we know that Twitter is banned in China, and by our kind of by allowing the Chinese diplomats to have access to China, we are somehow showing the difference that the Chinese people, the regular Chinese people, should have also access to these companies and to their products, because otherwise we would lose the argument that Twitter should be accessible and should not be banned in China if we are going to ban certain people from China on Twitter in our, I would say, like in our territories, although it's a global company. I would also bring the argument that the great warrior Napoleon has brought up, that we should never interrupt our enemies when they are making a mistake. We have numerous examples where Chinese diplomats, as well as Chinese members of the communist parties, or those who are part of the Chinese propaganda machinery, they are making many mistakes on Twitter and on social platforms as well, which are discrediting their way of fighting their war, or as well as their way how they try to influence our citizens. And I think in the long run, we will win this fight, but we need to be very sophisticated in the way how to approach the individual cases. I would bring one example from the EU. When the EU came up with a code of conduct, the companies, the private companies, social platforms can join voluntarily. And this code of conduct is trying to kind of find a way how to distinguish between a toxic and not toxic content, which should be brought down, and how, and the companies can, through allow this code of conduct, sort of invites them to report to the regulators or the EU institutions and the states how many or what content they have brought down, what amount of content they have brought down, and what kind of dangers lie within the institutions. I have to stop here.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you both. This was great. So we'll move into the round two, another 10 minutes to rebut some of the points made. So let me pick up on a couple of these points. And I'll start off directing a question to you, Mike. Essentially, what you've argued for and something that is a growing idea in US circles around China is essentially a reciprocity frame. Because China restricts speech in its own country, its diplomats should be restricted in the United States from a platform such as Twitter. But if we take the action of banning these accounts, are we not sort of mirroring these authoritarian tactics and giving China power to set the terms of how we engage in the information arena? Are we not saying that our system of openness, where we believe that the best ideas will rise, is failing?
That's a great question. So first, to answer that and also respond to some things that Miriam said, first of all, the idea that we're telling a private company what to do, we wrote a letter to Twitter asking them to reconsider their policy. We notably did not write a law dictating what that policy should be. My own view as a private citizen is that Twitter is toxic and we should all spend less time on it. And, the best way to get it out of our lives is simply not to engage in it. But I would also secondarily say that this is not about freedom of speech or us mistakenly out-China-ing China. It's about their government officials denying freedom of speech to their own citizens. And that's why I want to be clear. I think all of our attempts to draw this line between content that's acceptable and content that's not acceptable will get very difficult, right? And very politicized right away. So the standard should be a much simpler one, not based on content. It should be based on whether those government officials that use the platform are denying their own citizens access to that platform. And I think we should reject any moral equivalence between our attempts to enforce that standard and what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. The message we should all be sending loud and clear is a simple one. General Secretary Xi, tear down that firewall. So I would submit this is not an effort to control information. Indeed, it is precisely the opposite, an effort to expose the fact that the CCP controls information and wants to export their model of total ideological control around the world. And if it were just in their own borders, perhaps we would have less of a problem with it. But the CCP has demonstrated time and again that they're not content to have this model only exist within their own borders, that they want to export it to ours. They're ideologically opposed to the notion of liberalism itself, and they believe that competition between liberalism and Marxism is zero-sum. And if we don't engage in this competition more aggressively, we're going to wake up one day to realize that we've lost entirely.
And so Miriam, over to you. What do you say to that response, that this is really not about freedom of expression, but more using the tools at our disposal as coercive leverage to force a behavior change in the Chinese Communist Party vis-a-vis its Great Firewall? Is this a tool that we should be using to draw our line in the sand?
I have to say that I completely understand the argument that we have to show the Chinese side that if they are not allowing people to have access to information and free access or freedom of speech, we should not give them the freedom of speech in our territories or vis-a-vis our own citizens. I completely understand this argument. I'm just afraid that if we are starting to ban Chinese diplomats, next day we'll have to say that we are going to ban all members of the Communist Party, because the Chinese will always find way how to expose other people than those who are holding a diplomatic passports to our citizens and disinform them. And we'll be always a bit late and running behind, banning another group of Chinese representatives of the Chinese regime. For this reason, I think that we have to and I know that it's probably the more difficult way, but we have to make our population resilient to the Chinese influence. We have to help that our population understands that there is someone, and who is those people from China who are trying to disinform them, and to be resilient, because next day there are coming people from other countries. We do know, as I mentioned already, that people from ISIS, this was even more stronger in Europe than in the US, where disinforming our population and radicalizing our population. So I think that really a kind of a pill which would be good for all diseases is that if our citizens will be more aware of the dangers coming from the social platforms.
Thank you, Miriam. So just to push back on that for a second, I mean, do you think that these, if we were to only ban the Chinese diplomatic accounts, I mean, in some way that would not really make it very difficult to figure out who should be added sort of to that list? If there's a diplomatic registration there, then that would be the account that's banned. And do you think the system that we've had in place without doing this is effective?
No, I'm thinking that we should, I mean, I definitely don't think that the system so far is effective. I'm afraid that we have to be more sophisticated how to improve the resilience of our own societies, and not to go down the road that we'll be banning certain member or individual accounts just because of their not because of the content, because I think that's also one of the ways we decided to go through, and we are already, the platforms are already checking the content, and there is a certain agreement of what content should be brought down. So I think this is probably more strategic way than to name a group of people who should be taken down, because I think that there will be another group of people without diplomatic passports and will do the same harm.
Interesting response there. And so Mike, I guess I'm wondering, what about the harms of removing these accounts? What about the potential backlash against removing accounts? And, you know, as you mentioned, Twitter has taken the step to label state media. Why are these actions insufficient if it's known that these are accounts pushing propaganda messages or engaging in perhaps otherwise normal foreign diplomatic missions? Why is the step of outright banning them really necessary? And what do you say about the potential backlash that could create?
Well, I certainly welcome the recent moves by Twitter to at least label diplomats and wolf warriors, to give Twitter's users a better sense of what type of information they're giving. I think it's probably fair to say it's too early to tell whether that is sufficient. I suspect it isn't. And I just would like to confront this head on. There are what, 90 million members of the Chinese Communist Party. It's the massive, biggest political party in the world, as far as I know, bigger than the population of Germany itself. But there are 1.34 billion Chinese citizens. And so I would gladly ban the 90 million party members if it gives us a chance of improving the lives of over 1 billion people that don't have access to this information, that are being fed lies from their regime. And as I mentioned at the top, decoupling, especially when it comes to technology, is already here. Unfortunately, the Chinese Communist Party has decoupled itself from the internet that the rest of the world enjoys. That is both indisputable and extremely unfortunate. The question facing us now is not whether we want the Chinese people to be part of our internet. I unreservedly do. But whether we're going to continue providing a propaganda and disinformation platform to the party while they continue to deny their own people access. If anything, continuing to provide the party with a platform on Twitter effectively condones their decision to block the service. So I just would bring that up to say one of the bedrock foundations of our relationship with the Chinese Communist Party should be that malign action is met with consequence. And rather than allowing the CCP's restrictions on internet liberty to continue without objection, literally the least we can do is to ensure their leaders do not benefit from services they deny their own people. So vote yes on the proposition.
Miriam, any response to that? That this is really about drawing this line in the sand, and that this isn't about restricting the Chinese people from having a voice on the platform, but really using it as a tool for influence?
I would maybe only add that if we are going to defend the freedom of speech and freedom of access to information to the Chinese people, then the question would be why we are not so efficient, and why we are not taking care of the freedom of speech and freedom of or access to information to people in other totalitarian regimes, that why we are only focusing on China, and will be accused that it's because there are economic interests of the West. And I will also bring another argument, is that we would be also asked why we are, for example, allowing the children of the Chinese Communist members to study in our university when there are millions or millions of people who have no access to education in China. So there are also other rights or who are being violated vis-a-vis the Chinese population or population of people in other totalitarian regimes. So I think that unless we have a more complex and more or less selective answer, we should vote no to the ban of the Chinese diplomats on Twitter.
Mike, any response to that in particular? Otherwise, I'll direct another question your way before we run.
Well, I actually think that's an area where Miriam and I are aligned. I think we should be taking a consistent position with autocratic and totalitarian regimes around the world. And I think our great strength in the United States is that we are lucky to have a network of democratic countries and a network of allies around the world that the CCP cannot hope to match. And so I think we should be doing everything possible to draw closer to our friends and partners around the world in defense of our common values and against the forces of autocracy and repression that we're seeing, not just in China, but in other areas around the world. So we agree on that. I also think we should be taking a tougher approach to allowing CCP princelings to study in our universities, particularly those who are doing United Front work or outright espionage against the United States. So I think that's an area where we overlap. But maybe I just could quickly address a point Miriam had brought up earlier, the sort of Napoleon point, don't get in the way of your enemy doing something stupid. It is true that the Wolf Warriors seem very ham-handed. But if you watch the Wolf Warrior movies that they get their name from, which are available on YouTube, they make Michael Bay movies look subtle in comparison. Really, the audience they're playing to sometimes is a domestic one. And it's all about enhancing the power of the regime and hyping up the threat that the evil Americans and the West poses in order to get people to obey the party without question. I also would say it's not obvious to me that they are having no effect. After the killing of George Floyd, for example, CCP Wolf Warriors exploited the crisis. They started sharing protest slogans on social media. State TV has highlighted the protests as evidence that American democracy is weak and hypocritical, that we no longer have the moral authority to criticize them for Tiananmen Square. So I think it's too early to tell what type of effect this is having in our country. And what we learned in 2016 is that foreign actors with a very modest investment of resources can be quite effective in pitting Americans against each other and causing us to grow more divided as a country. And that's something we need to guard against. So vote yes.
All right, thank you. Unfortunately, time is up. We've heard some strong arguments on either side, and now we're going to repeat the poll. Should Chinese diplomatic accounts be banned on Twitter? I'd ask the audience, please, to vote again. And we can see who has managed to convince the lion's share of our audience. In the meantime, I'll announce that Face Off will return on October 15th for the discussion on the withdrawal from the JCPOA. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the poll is off. And now let's have a look at the results. In the initial poll, the results showed that 25% of you said yes, that Chinese diplomatic accounts should be banned on Twitter. 75% said no. Now going over to the final poll. In this instance, 39% said yes, and 61% said no. So yes and no, yes picked up more votes and managed to persuade most of you or a larger part of you, but of course the debate will continue on, and I think this is really just the beginning of an important conversation. So I'll say a big thank you to Mike and Miriam for joining us and arguing your cases so succinctly and responding to each other's points. I'd also like to thank my GMF colleagues, Elizabeth Winter, Astrid Zebarth, and Christina Couch for putting this together in this new series, Face Off. And would like to thank you, of course, our audience, for tuning in. We'll return next month. And until then, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you, Miriam. You're always welcome in Wisconsin.
I will.